Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Mirabelle. I'm chairman of the Research Support and Prevention Committee. And on behalf of myself and my colleagues at Tour de Cure and the entire Tour de Cure family, I'd like to welcome you to this, our first live webinar series. Professor Michelle Haber is Executive Director of the Children's Cancer Institute. Professor Richard Locke is with the Children's Cancer Institute and one of the lead researchers within that group. They, along with their colleagues at CCIA, are well known to Tour de Cure. We're very pleased to have them with us today. What's happening now with the sort of shutdown that we've all been forced to work under? So maybe can you take us through perhaps what's happening on a day-to-day basis and how it's changed by virtue of the shutdown?
We would normally have the vast majority of our scientists actually working in the laboratories at the bench with all of those images that you have of scientists in white coats and masks and gloves and actually working, doing experiments at the bench, working with cancer cells, with tissue from patients, with experimental models of cancer where we can test new drugs and treatments, or where we can look at the genetic structure of the cells and work out what it is that's going on. That's where our people mostly are, but we also have a significant proportion of our scientists who are what we call our dry lab people. And they're people who sit in front of their computers, they're analyzing the data, they're understanding what the genetic changes mean, they're interpreting the data, and they're writing up and getting that data presented for publication or for discussion at scientific meetings. So what's happened since this COVID crisis hit us is that balance has changed dramatically. And instead of what would have probably been 80% wet lab and 20% dry lab, we've now reversed that completely. And we've got probably 90% of all of our staff at the Institute are working from home safely, but we have got a core group of researchers who are in the lab on a daily basis, obviously socially distanced and very safe and protected within this environment, but working on what we call the absolutely critical, cannot stop aspects of our research. And they include aspects of research where we're doing patient diagnostics or testing, actually analyzing patient samples, understanding what is driving individual children's cancers, and then returning that information to the clinicians in real time to determine treatment decisions by the clinicians who are treating those kids. So we have not stopped that at all. We have those teams in. That's both for our Zero Childhood Cancer, which is our precision medicine program. We also have a national leukemia diagnostic program called Minimal Residual Disease Testing. And in fact, that's one of the programs that Tour de Cure funded us for a number of years, and actually resulted in a doubling of the survival rates of children with high-risk leukemia from 35% to over 70% in the space of a decade. And that was research funded by Tour de Cure. And so that's now standard of care for all children in the country who are diagnosed with high risk, or who have high-risk acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which is the commonest childhood cancer. And those teams are in the lab. We are not stopping that. That's core to our mission, our vision. And so they're working there under challenging circumstances because they're not in their usual teams. We've had to split the teams into two so that we've got backups in case someone on one team got sick. But basically, those guys and girls are doing their job and making sure that those results get out there. Our researchers who are at home are also being very productive. So there are several aspects to science. First, you have to do the experiments, and then you have to work out what the data means. So, and often it's hard to find the time to do that in-depth analysis, to review the literature, to make sure you truly understand it, to write up your results, to put them in a publication that will share those results with the world. And so that's what our teams who are at home are focusing on at the moment. And that's keeping them very busy because that's a huge part of science. So it's a bit of a shift, but we are making sure that the science, to the best of our ability under these difficult circumstances, is proceeding.
We have some very important drug testing programs and collaborations that are going on an international scale. We have a long-standing relationship with the National Cancer Institute in the US, in which we test novel drugs to prioritize them for clinical trials for children with high-risk cancers, and that's a long-standing funding that we've had for 15 years, and it's critical that research is continued, and we've had to make some adjustments because, as Michelle said, we've got to make sure that we have teams coming in on separate days. So we're continuing that vital research, but we've had to adjust teams so that they come in on alternate days. They don't socialize with each other, but in the same token that they communicate with each other to ensure that the work is done as required every day. So we're continuing to do that vital research to make our commitments to the National Cancer Institute. One of the characteristics of being a scientist, I've learned, is that you have to be resilient and you have to be adaptable. And in my dealings with my national and international collaborators, we're continuing to collaborate. We're continuing to plan future collaborations. In that regard, very little has changed in what I do, because I'm still having those video conferences on an international scale, except that I'm now doing it from home as opposed to going into my office almost every day, which has been quite an adjustment.
What is a mouse model, and what's the relevance to that if you have a lab which has to go into hibernation, to use that term?
We are making sure that all of our models are being protected. That is one of the areas that we've regarded as essential research, because they are absolutely critical, these models, to our research and our ability to translate what we do in the laboratory into the clinic.
So broadly speaking, there are two mouse models of cancer. One is which you can actually take laboratory mouse strains and genetically engineer them to actually develop a cancer that has similar traits to human cancer. So these are then genetically engineered mouse models. So the mouse strain itself will express human genes that drive the cancer, and so it's vital to maintain those strains of mice. The second main model is where you have laboratory strains of mice that lack an immune system, and again, these mice won't live outside of a laboratory environment. But then you can take these mice and you can inoculate them with human cancer. So you take a patient-derived tumor, as Michelle has said, and some people call these mice avatars, but then you inject the human cancer cells into the mice, and they develop essentially a human cancer. And that's one of the main models that we use to test new drugs, to prioritize them for clinical trials in kids with cancer. But
these models are quite critical to our research, and therefore we have a core team of our people making sure that those models are protected, because they are absolutely key to our ability to deliver better, safer treatments for the children that we're focused on delivering cures for. The research that we're able to undertake and the cures that we're able to deliver and the new treatments that we're able to develop are a partnership between the skills and capabilities of our scientists and the doctors, in partnership with the community and with government. In this environment, fundraising is very challenging. That we are reliant on many sources of fundraising, but a very major one is events, whether it's bike rides, whether it's swimming events like the Balmoral Swim, whether it's balls, like your snowball or our diamond ball. These raise millions of dollars for us, and in a heartbeat, these have evaporated in the last 3 weeks, as any event. Well, events don't exist anymore, frankly. Yeah. So the impact can be measured in terms of millions of dollars worth of lost funding. It is extremely challenging. Zero Childhood Cancer is our flagship program in terms of how our research impacts on a day-to-day basis of the lives of children with cancer, how the results of testing each child's cancer will then be used to determine their treatment by their doctors, ensuring that we can continue to have support from that, from our community, from our funders, and also, talking to government about how they will hopefully be able to support this program into the longer term as well. These are critical issues for us at the Institute because these are life-saving programs that can change the course of individuals and families, children's lives. There is no question of that.
How do the young researchers within your teams, how do they respond to that? Maybe Richard, I can turn that one to you and get you to respond to that question.
You know, we have teams of bright young researchers who their first love is to get into the lab and do experiments, as I did 30 years ago, and that's how you start out in science. And they love to come in and they love to go into the lab and they love to discover things and be collaborating with their colleagues. And obviously, when they are then asked to be socially responsible and only come into the lab when absolutely necessary and don't go out. It's a challenge for them, as it is with any young person. I'm having twice weekly conferences with my group to try and still instill that group mentality and collaboration and individual meetings with them all by video to ensure that they're still having a balanced life in as much as they can, to not be working the whole time and take regular breaks. But a lot of young people are facing this challenge, and but quite frankly, I've been inspired by the responses I've seen in the young researchers in the Institute to this crisis.
Do you see any impacts over the long term to the shape of research, which has been on a particular path up until this point in time? We hit what is clearly a break in rhythm. Do you think it has a longer term impact on either the outcomes or the shape of research coming out of this crisis?
I think if it's 3 months, we will be okay. And if we're able to protect our assets, which are our people and our critical model systems, then I don't see it having a longer term impact. The longer this goes on, the more the likelihood of really significantly delaying new discoveries, because while our people are at home and they're writing up their existing data and they're analysing that, that's great. But there will be a point at which that will be done, and then they will be wanting to start generating new data. And if they're not able to go back into the labs and do that, then that will cause a hiatus, a period of loss that we won't get back, and we'll just have to redouble our efforts when we do get back into the lab to make up for lost time.
It's going to be interesting to see when we come out of this how the research environment may change in terms of emphasis of government on preventing these sort of these crises re-happening in the future.
How are families dealing with it in this new environment? How's that family that's already so challenged dealing with these new constraints?
The parents are universally very stressed by this. Parents whose kids who have been off treatment and doing well are ringing and saying, are their children more susceptible? Are they at greater risk? Do they need to protect them? Is this, they live with the ever-present fear of relapse, but now suddenly there's a new fear. Are they likely to get sick and be taken away from them in a new way? And for the parents on the ward, a very high degree of anxiety about what this means if this were to come into the hospital. If I think that this is for parents of kids with cancer, it's a devastating time when their children are diagnosed. The journey is one that anyone who's spoken to parents of kids with cancer is emotive and fraught with stress and pain and anxiety. And this is just another level of distress on top of that. So it's certainly not making life any easier for these families, that's for sure.